Hello there, and welcome to this module on financial market positions, so long and short positions, as well as a little bit of leverage to see how we can put some rocket fuel on those returns. Okay, the basics. So a long position is one which gains when the asset values increase. So the most basic level of this, you just purchase the stock. You buy a share, it goes up in value, you have a gain. That gain is unrealized until you sell it, but it's still a paper gain. Now you can create similar gains if you buy call options on that underlying stock, because the call option gives you the right to buy the asset at a fixed price. So if the asset price is higher than that, well, you can buy the asset at the nice low fixed price and then decide to sell the asset simultaneously in the market, and you can pocket the difference. More gains to be had, perhaps not quite as much when the asset values increase, is by selling put options. Now, this is taking a short position effectively in a put option. And a put option is out of the money when the asset value increases. So the long position will not exercise it, but you as the option writer will have taken the premium, and you've got a small bit of income that way. Similar to a long stock position, a long future or forward position will gain. A long future or forward allows you to, unlike a call option, it requires you to buy the asset at a fixed price. But as I said before, if the asset value is higher than that at expiry, then your gain is the difference. Now, a short position gains when an asset value decreases. Now, if you sell the asset short, and more on that in a bit, you can borrow the asset and sell it in the market, buying it back later for a lower price, and then you cover your short position. If you sell a call option, this is the opposite really of the calls and puts in the long bullet point above. If you sell a call option and the asset value decreases, the call option will not be exercised against you and you keep the premium. Purchase, take a long position in a put option. This gives you the right to sell the asset at a nice high fixed price when the asset value has fallen, and your gain is the difference between the two. And unlike the long position, where we took a long future or forward position, a short future or forward position, which requires you to sell the asset at a fixed price, will clearly gain when the underlying asset value falls. Now, one of the problems that investors sometimes have when they're taking either long or short positions is that the returns are fairly thin. The expected returns are not very high. You can amplify those returns by adding financial leverage into your position. So you don't pay for the entire price of the asset yourself. Instead you borrow some of that purchase price. You put in a smaller part of your own money. You're going to have to repay that loan. But if you have a positive return on the asset, then your leveraged return overall, and we'll look at a worked example in a second, your leveraged return overall would be higher than it would have been without the leverage. But there's no such thing as a free lunch, of course. If it's a negative return on the asset, your leveraged return will be lower. It will be worse than it would have been otherwise. Okay, just going back to selling short, it's a common question. How can we sell something we don't own? Well, if you think that an asset value is likely to decrease, there's not much point in buying it because your selling price in the future will be lower than that. Instead, you need to sell it. And you don't own it yet, so we need to borrow it from somebody else. So you borrow the asset from another party who owns the stock, and you promise to return that asset to them later. We sell that stock in the market, hopefully at its nice high price, and later we will buy it back. And if we thought that the asset price was going to fall and that actually happens, then we've made a profit because we've sold for more than we bought. We then have to return that asset to the lender, and that's known as covering the short position. So your profit is the original selling price minus the repurchase price. That's your gross profit, if you like. And eating into that profit will be any trading commissions and any interest you had to pay for borrowing the stock in the first place. Now, if you are a stockholder and you're approached by a short seller to borrow the stock from you, you'll have a couple of concerns. Firstly, what happens when the dividends are paid? You're going to demand compensation for that. So the stock lender, the original owner of the stock, will receive all of the dividends paid during the life of the short position. The short seller will have to pay those to the lender. The other thing you'd be worried about as a stock lender is not receiving the stock back. So the short seller will have to deposit some collateral, sometimes known as a margin payment, so that if the stock is not returned, they will forfeit that collateral. This position will pay off if we sell high and buy low. So you may have an inclination to believe that the asset price is going to fall, but you're only going to profit if that actually happens. Okay, now a way of leveraging your position is buying stock on margin. So as we mentioned a few moments ago, this is where we don't pay for the entire purchase price ourselves. Instead, we will borrow a portion of that purchase price. The stock will be held as collateral, so we'll buy the stock and then we'll have to deposit that stock as collateral in case we don't repay the loan. Now the initial margin requirement here, this is the minimum amount of our own money we have to put in, so our minimum equity stake at the time of purchase. Now when we buy stock here, this is a long position, so we'll gain if the asset increases during the life of our position, and we'll lose if the asset falls in value. Now, when the asset falls in value, the lender of the margin here, they're going to get a bit worried. They're going to be worried that you're going to default and not repay the loan. So they may well execute a margin call. You need to top up that margin payment, top up your equity percentage at some point after purchase. And that will happen at a preset position, which we'll look at with some numbers in just a second. Okay. The equity percentage that you as the investor hold in this position at any one point in time is the value of the stock minus the amount you've borrowed in margin, all over the value of the stock. Let's have a look at an example to bring all this to life then. So we've got an investor, they buy 1,000 shares of a stock. The initial margin requirement is 40%. So we need to put in 40% of our own money into this. The price is $100 per share. Okay, so we're going to have to put in $40 of our own money and borrow the remaining 60. We will have to pay an interest rate on that borrowing, which is 4%. There are some dividends accruing to the position. We'll keep all those, $2 per share. Commission on trades, on purchases and sales is 5 cents per share. And then a year later, happy days, the stock has gone up in value to $110. We're going to calculate the leverage ratio, so the ratio of borrowed funds to our equity stake, and our overall return on the position. Okay, the leverage ratio, first of all, pretty useful formula for us to know for the exam. It's simply 1 over the initial margin. So 1 over 40% is 2.5. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you'd bought the stock entirely with your own money, you just standard long position, and the stock returns 10%, well, the leverage return with a leverage ratio of 2.5 will give you, when all said and done, a return 2.5 times higher, so 25% on the equity investment. That's ignoring costs and commissions, but overall there, that leverage ratio is how much your return is amplified. You multiply your pre-leverage return by the leverage ratio, you get your post-leverage return. Let's see if we can get a result like that with our worked example. Okay, so how much of our own money do we have to put in? It's 40%, remember, that initial margin. Each share was $100, so $40 per share, and there were 1,000 shares. So in total, we are putting $40,000 of our own money into this. Now, we do have to pay commission when we purchased the shares. It was 5 cents per share. That's $50 in total. So overall, we've put in, to create this position, $40,050 of our own money. Now let's see what happens at the end. Okay, so at the end of the period, we'll have received dividends of $2,000, so $2 per share. We have to pay loan on the interest. Remember, we borrowed $60,000 on margin. Now that's 4% was the margin loan rate, so that's interest of $2,400 that we have to pay. Happily, the shares have gone up in value, so $110, 1,000 shares gives you $110,000. We do have to pay trading commission again. It's 1,000 shares, 5 cents. So it's the same commission as before, $50. That's going to eat into our proceeds. So overall, how much money do we have? Well, we've got the 110,000 from selling the shares. We've got the 2,000 from the dividends. We have to repay that margin loan, don't forget. So that's 60,000 going back to the margin lender, plus the interest that they've charged, 2,400, and then knock off the trading fees of 50. So we've turned our initial cash inflow into $49,550. So what's that in a return? Well, when all said and done, we're left with $49,550, and it cost us $40,050 to create that position. That is an overall return of the period of 23.72. Now, remember, this is a 10% unleveraged return. The shares went up from 100 to 110. And as we know, with a leverage ratio of 2.5, we would be expecting a return of 25%. But of course, we do have those commissions and interest costs to pay, which just eats into that ever so slightly. But hey, still a pretty good result. I'd rather have a 23.72% return than only a 10% return. Now, in that example, the stock went up in value, so we didn't really have to worry about putting any more margin in to the position. But if the stock value begins to fall, and specifically if our equity stake falls below the maintenance margin percentage set by the margin lender, then we need to top up our equity stake by adding cash or collateral. Either that, or we need to exit the position early. Now, in the exam, you may well be asked at what price a margin call will be made, and that's known as the trigger price. So we've got our price there, starting price today, times 1 minus the initial margin over 1 minus the maintenance margin. Let's put some numbers on that, and hopefully it will make sense. So if we buy stock on margin at a price of $40, okay, now the initial margin requirement's 50, and the maintenance margin is 25%. So if our equity stake falls to 25%, we're going to need to top up our margin. So what's your trigger price? Well, let's work it out here. It's 1 minus the initial margin is up here, so 1 minus 50%, 1 minus the maintenance margin on the bottom, all multiplied by the initial price of $40, and that tells us that our trigger price for a margin call is $26.67. At that point, our equity stake will have fallen to the maintenance margin of 25%, and we're going to need to make a top up.